author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Meeny, meeny, tekel upharsin. That's what the invisible hand wrote on the wall in the book of Daniel. You've been weighed and measured and found wanting, and your kingdom will be torn asunder. Well, is such writing on the wall for President Joe Biden, as he now has to face American voters with an actual track record in office in the run-up to 2024? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk Joe Biden's announcement, what this means for him, what it means for VP Kamala Harris, and what it means for the American public. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and WPNS on 1140 AM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio with Tim Donner, continuing our analysis of Biden's 2024 announcement. Now, Tim, any election is, of course, always about the numbers. So what do the polls tell us on America's feeling regarding Joe Biden and a potential second term?
Well, let's go back to 2020-21 and Trump's loss and his protestations, his legal actions, his claims. And then January 6th happened. And I think there was a sense across the country that, Trump was finished. There was no way he was going to be able to come back even if he tried. So it's really remarkable, Mark, that here we are just 2 years and 3 months later, and Donald Trump is ahead of Joe Biden in 3 of the 4 most recent polls conducted by credible organizations. He's up 7, Donald Trump is, against Biden and Rasmussen. He's up 5 points in the Harvard-Harris poll. And he's also up in the YouGov poll. So he is more than a point ahead on average, according to Real Clear Politics. I think that's as much a statement about Joe Biden, really, as it is about Donald Trump, because Biden is at an unelectable approval level right now. He's at 42.8%. No president has ever been reelected with approval numbers that low. You can go back to Jimmy Carter. You can go back to George H.W. Bush. You can go back to Trump, and you look at their approval numbers. They were not reelect numbers, and that's where Biden is. But he's hoping that he can scare the people out of another term of Trump, assuming Trump is the nominee. And he's utterly convinced, Mark, especially since he already finished ahead of Trump once, that he can do it again. And he can convince his party that he's the only one that can do it.
I think that's what it's going to come down to, is whether he can convince his voters that he can beat Trump again. Because, sure, he spent so much time in the basement in Delaware during the first campaign. He doesn't have that excuse anymore. And, I mean, Tim, you know campaigning. You have been a United States Senate candidate. And so you know what a physical toll it takes on an individual actually getting out there and doing campaigning. I just don't think Joe Biden's up for it. I don't think he has the energy or the spirit to do it.
Well, he's got some major disadvantages that he didn't have in 2020, or I might say he no longer is able to exploit the radical disadvantages that Donald Trump had trying to fix a pandemic which hadn't happened in 100 years. No matter what Trump did, as soon as one person died, Joe Biden was going to stand in the cheap seats on the sidelines and blame it. That was easy to do. He could attack the unemployment
Tim,
rate.
could I just interrupt you on that point? I remember Joe Biden saying, and he pointed out a specific number of deaths that had taken place due to COVID under Donald Trump, and he said, no man with this many deaths under his belt, words to this effect, deserves to be president. And since then, there have been more than under Donald Trump, under his leadership.
Well, the point
but of
is
course,
that
nobody wants to remind him of that, right?
Well, that was the most bizarre election of our lifetimes because of the pandemic, which completely changed the narrative. I think Trump was clearly on a track to be reelected because of the strength of the economy. We were at peace and had prosperity. Then the pandemic changed everything. Joe Biden was able to exploit it. The pandemic was the greatest gift Joe Biden could ever have received because he could, he could blame Trump for the 20% unemployment rate, for the hundreds of thousands of deaths with no responsibility of his own, right? He had nothing he had to do. Now, 4 years later, he has no pandemic to fall back on. He has no excuse to be in his basement, right? And he's going to have to come out and take the fight to Trump because his whole raison d'etre, as he said, even in his reelect announcement on video, was the threat of extreme MAGA fascism, essentially, that don't look at me, look at the alternative, and you'll see that I look that much better.
Tim, I think that's such a funny point you make there, because there's, and I'm going to come back to this poll as well. I think it was the NBC poll that came out this week, and it was, and it asked it was 1,000 people in the poll. 800, I think, were likely voters, 200 just registered voters, so 1,000 in total. And it was, one of the questions was, which group do you have the more positive opinion of? Democrats, Republicans, MAGA movement. And it was MAGA movement that had a more favorable response than either of the other two.
Is that right?
That is right.
That's incredible.
Now, also, with that poll, there's something that I think is really important, because sometimes it's really hard to find consistency across polls. But there's one aspect that definitely was, and that's those voters who definitely, quote, definitely want Joe Biden to run again in 2024. And that was just 26% in the NBC poll. Now, oddly enough, just a week prior to that, the Associated Press, I think it was also in association with NORC, they also found just 26% definitely want Joe Biden to run again. Now, 26% definitely.
That's just his immediate family.
That's a death knell, isn't it, Tim? I mean,
well,
voter enthusiasm be damned, right?
True. Let's go back again to the state of Donald Trump on January 7th, 2021. And to look at where we've come since then, the fact that more people don't want Biden to run than the number that don't want Trump to run. Okay, there's close to 50,
I think it was 41% want Donald Trump to definitely run again. 41%.
Right, that's it. So that's a 59% don't want him to run again, and yet Biden even exceeds that. So what this really says is the country is desperate for something other than a rematch of Biden versus Trump. Neither guy, I mean, people would prefer Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis, to put it another way. The next generation, I think people think that it's time for a new generation of leaders, which is what DeSantis has going for him. But Ron DeSantis is getting absolutely no momentum at this point because everything is behind Trump because he's been martyred by his indictment. And so Republicans are coming to his defense. And even those who will oppose him in the Republican primary have to come to Trump's defense because of the trumped up charges ginned up by the Democrats against him.
We'll be talking more about this Rumble in the Jungle, Thriller in Manila, Trump v. Biden 2024 later in the show. After this short break, we're coming back talking about Joe Biden's first term and how well he can leverage that into a 2024 bid. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back speaking with Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we covered Joe Biden's polling numbers and his record in office. But now I want to look at the field of 2024 contenders and what we expect to happen as 2024 approaches. Tim, on the Democrat side, we have two other candidates in the race for the nomination. There's Marianne Williamson, Robert Kennedy Jr. What do you make of them as candidates, and do you think the DNC will give them any oxygen at all?
No. Next question. No, the answer is that's a hard no.
Right.
Now, in the case of Marianne Williamson, let's be honest, she's kind of a flake, and she's a novelty candidate. It's it's a candidacy for her ego to be stroked.
You know what I think about when I think
2 or 3%.
When I think about Marianne Williamson, it seems to me that she's a harmless candidate, as in she's not going to pull any great sway away from the main candidate. She's not going to do any major damage. And I think in politics, perhaps being called harmless is the worst adjective to describe someone, isn't it?
Yes, it's true. She is, she's not to be taken seriously. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a different story because of his name. And, I wrote a piece on this about how the Kennedy family always closed ranks when one of their own was running for any kind of political office. They always supported anybody from the Kennedy family who was running. But of course, this time, they're not. They are supporting Joe Biden for, I guess, pretty obvious reasons, because if you see a schism where the Kennedy family is divided from the current Democratic power holders, you'd have a serious problem. But I do think that young Bobby Kennedy has a story to tell. He has a different vision for the Democratic Party, and it's one that, to this point, has attracted roughly 15% of Democrats, maybe just on his name, because I don't think they know much about him. He's had a checkered past, to be sure. He struggled with drugs and his physical health, but because he's a Kennedy, he's going to get a platform, and he will get people to listen to him, because what he's talking about largely is the wedding of corporations and the government into one huge power block, which threatens the United States and the people. And I think this is a worthy topic for people to hear. But I think it does weaken Biden a bit that a Kennedy's running against him. But it's not an abiding threat.
Sure. A couple of things on Mr. Kennedy Jr. So obviously he talks about the cooperation between government and big business, essentially. Just as another historical aside, Benito Mussolini said everything within the state, everything for the state, nothing outside the state. So essentially his proto-fascism idea was that it was big government and big business melded together in one, and that's certainly something to think about.
Indeed. Good point.
I think, surprisingly, I'm hearing a lot of conservatives who are all too happy to listen to Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yes.
And that's an interesting point, don't you think? That he's got...
Politics makes really strange bedfellows. And Robert F. Kennedy now is aligned with Steve Bannon, of all people, who, of course, was the famously mercurial senior advisor to Donald Trump until he blew himself out of the water by leaking like crazy. So he is the most unpredictable character practically in politics, but he has made bed with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the issue of vaccines, because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been a crusader against vaccines for many years and tied it to autism. Now, I'm in a pretty good position to comment on that because I have two kids, both of whom are autistic. And they're at different areas of the spectrum and they're both high functioning. But the point is that we looked into vaccines as a cause for years after the fact when it was too late. And I don't see any compelling evidence that what he claims, which is particularly the measles, mumps, and rubella
Rubella, yeah.
vaccine, has caused autism. But he is a crusader on that topic. He's got a large audience of people, and he has made unconventional alliances, which I think make him a lot more viable as a opponent than Marianne Williamson, to be sure.
Yeah. Also, he's also an environmental lawyer by trade, which I think could be something that Democrat voters are looking for.
He has been. He
Yeah.
particularly was a crusader on the issue of mercury poisoning, and he, once served as as an assistant district attorney in New York, and he was a pretty hardcore environmental lawyer. So there is something for Democrats there for him. But I think Democrats they're driven by the fear of Donald Trump returning, and I think that's why they'll almost universally get behind Joe Biden, because they figure he gives them the best chance to prevent 45 from becoming 47.
Well, speaking of 45 and potentially 47 there, I don't see that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are in a particularly similar position, because the two top contenders for the GOP both have quite a lot of support. Now, obviously, the polls show that Donald Trump has a lot more support within the party than Ron DeSantis. But if Donald Trump weren't in the party, then, or running for election, then Ron DeSantis would most likely gain all of that support, and perhaps even a little more, wouldn't he? So it's more a question of there are two viable contenders for the GOP nomination, whereas there's only one for the Democrats.
Yes, that's true. Now, you might be able to expand that to say that, Nikki Haley is a viable candidate.
Yeah.
Mike Pence, if he announces, which he's given every indication that he will, although he hasn't officially announced, he would be a viable alternative. But realistically, in the polls, it's a two-horse race. Now, people make a lot of the fact, and they should, that Trump still leads DeSantis by large margins in a Republican primary. But that's just a projected primary. Remember that Ron DeSantis hasn't even announced yet. He has not become a candidate yet. He is just a likely candidate or a projected candidate. And presidential politics is different than Florida gubernatorial politics. So I think there's a lot of people that are waiting to see whether he can convert his stunning success in Florida to the national stage. And I would look at the numbers after he's been in for a month or two to see where he levels off, because I don't think he's going to be any 30 points behind Trump like he is now.
I think you're probably right on that, but either way, I expect we're heading towards a 2024 Beyond the Thunderdome situation.
We dismiss history at our peril. Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're back with longtime host of Liberty Nation Radio and senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier in the show, we spoke about a potential President Harris and Biden's poor polling numbers. And now I want to move on to Biden's track record in office and how that's going to impact voters. Tim, in 2020 and 2020, Biden could make all the promises he wanted about what kind of president he was going to be. And there was no one who could really, I guess, contradict him on that. And it covered a lot of sins with the media. But now we have almost 3 years worth of data and debacles. So do you think his record to date will be a detriment for 2024 or a plus?
Certainly a detriment. I think it's just a matter of to what degree. Now, I will say that progressives have been pleasantly surprised by his willingness to embrace radically left policies. So I think the progressive base, especially with the prospect of Trump returning, is going to be energized by anybody with a D next to his name. But especially Biden, I think, because they've gotten past the sense that he's not Bernie, he's not going to do the progressive stuff. He is doing it. He Look, when he ran in 2020, he presented himself as a placeholder, a transitional figure who would, hold the White House for a rising generation of Democrats. But of course, the moment he got into the White House, he said his intent was to run for reelection. For a guy who spent 50 years in the swamp, Mark, of course, he can so seamlessly make statements and then reverse field the next week and pretend he never said it with a compliant, protective, Praetorian guard,
Yeah.
Praetorian guard of a media. He doesn't have to worry about contradictions.
I'd like to make a quick point about Praetorian guards that historically it's quite interesting. So obviously during the Roman Republic, Roman Empire, you had the Praetorian guards who would surround the notable person they were protecting, and what they would carry with them was essentially an axe head around a bundle of sticks, and this bundle of sticks was called a fasci, which is where we get the word fascist from. So that kind of gives you an idea on my opinion of Mr. Joe Biden.
Well, look, he number one, he said he was a transitional figure and implied strongly he was just running for one term.
There's a technical term for that, Tim. There is a technical term for that. It's called a lie.
Yeah, but not for a politician, Mark. There's a different standard. For example, now the Republicans have pulled out his statement during the primaries in 2020 that he guarantees they will put an end to fossil fuels. And then he claimed he never said it, that it was all a lie, even though it was right there on video. Yeah. So somebody who's been in politics for 50 years like him can just lie with utter impunity and get away with it. But to more directly to the point of what you ask, I think he's done some progressive policy maneuvers which have made Democrats happy. The Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't have anything to do with reducing inflation, but it's a basket of goodies that the left has liked. He has pushed along sort of an anti-racist agenda because that's what's expected of him. And he's a very, shall we say, malleable politician. But the problem he's got that he can't run away from is the circular problem with the economy. And what I mean is when inflation reached up to the 9-10% level, the Fed was forced to introduce a series of rapid fire interest rate increases to reduce inflation. The problem is that will inevitably lead to a recession. And I don't mean the technical recession we have now, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, but I mean a serious recession where people really feel it. It's sort of like the being on a boat and you've got a hole in the front and a hole in the back, and you go to plug the hole in the front and the one in the back starts leaking through. And then you fix that, and then it comes up through the front. So it's either inflation or it's a recession. And now the biggest difference for Joe Biden from 2020 to 2024 is not just the pandemic, although that's enormous, not just the George Floyd riots, which accrued to his advantage somehow. But it is the fact that he's got a record that can be compared to Trump's. And I don't think there's any comparison when it comes to the state of the economy in the Trump administration up through March of 2020 when the pandemic hit, and the Biden economy. Now, he can try to claim that the Trump economy was getting ready to tank anyway before the pandemic came, but that will strain
rings hollow, doesn't it?
The least. I think what he's got to do, frankly, Mark, is if Joe Biden is running against Trump, they believe they can win because he can just run footage of January 6th sort of on a loop tape around the clock for the entire general election campaign. But I think they might be far more hesitant to do that now that we have seen the footage released on the dearly departed Tucker Carlson's Fox show, indicating that you know, the shaman,
Yeah.
Jacob Chansley, was not the violent criminal that they had labeled him. He proved to be quite different than that, which means their claims on January 6th don't hold the water they did until the release of that new footage. So, that's what they're dealing with. But Trump is someone that does scare off a significant percentage of the country. I think that's undeniable.
Well, there's the idea that with Republicans, the candidate has to appeal to the base. He has to be right in there. They have to love the contender, essentially. But with the Democrats, really, it seems to me that they need somebody that's central, because the Democrat Party is not one party anymore. I mean, they can say it's covered by a big tent, but there's some almost polar opposites there, isn't there? You point out the progressive faction were quite happy with Joe Biden, but there's a lot of fiscally responsible Democrats, maybe not in Congress, but across the country.
Sprinkled across the country.
Yeah.
Well, look, Democrats that run in red states have to be fiscally responsible and run to the center. They have to. But in Washington, of course, it's deep blue in terms of let's put it this way. To the Democrats, as long as there's a D next to his name, it doesn't much matter. And I think we found that out with Joe Biden. And we certainly found it out with John Fetterman, the newly minted senator from Pennsylvania, who underwent a stroke, couldn't talk, started a debate by saying, "Good night, everybody." Then he did get elected. He won by 4 points in a purple state. And then he went into the hospital for clinical depression for 2 months, which is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But the point is, he had a D next to his name. And, with the media being as uncritical as they are of the left, all you have to do is have a D next to your name, it seems, in order to be viable.
Yeah, it always reminds me of the PJ O'Rourke story, where he came back from college and told, with his long hair, and he told his grandmother, "Grandma, I'm a communist," and she says, "Well, at least you're not a Democrat." Anyway, we'll be back with Tim after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Joe Biden's presidential announcement featured VP Kamala Harris a staggering 13 times. Now, as the British newspaper The Telegraph described it, this was not a campaign launch. It was rather an anointment of Miss Harris. And that begs the question, who will Democrat voters be casting their ballot for in 2024? Well, we're joined by longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, to pass the whole situation. So Tim, I guess the first question has to be, is the 2024 vote for Democrats, is that for Joe Biden or for Kamala Harris?
Well, I think it's the headline to my most recent article on LibertyNation.com pretty much answers the question. Biden to announce, but is it really Kamala on the ballot? And the reasons are fairly obvious. I mean, look, Biden is going to be 82 years old next year when he runs for re-election, which means he'd be 86 when his term would be over. I mean, he was already the oldest president ever to take the oath of office. There's already questions about him being old even beyond his years. So if people think that they're voting for a full term of Joe Biden, I think they're burying their heads in the sand, because it seems the most likely strategy for Democrats will be to if Biden gets reelected to at some point in that term, probably after the midterms in 2026, for him to quietly slip out the back, Jack, as the Paul Simon song said.
No need to discuss much.
No need to discuss.
Get on the bus, Gus.
He'll get on the bus, Gus, and elevate Kamala to the into the highest position in the land, because look, that's the only way for them to know if she's even viable for 2028. Most people think she isn't, but it would then give them time to see if she, can pass muster as commander in chief. And then if she can't, they'll have to bail out and look at Gavin Newsom and others. But look, he's 82 years old, beyond his years. A vote for Joe Biden is effectively a vote for Kamala Harris.
Now, I do want to pick up on something you said there, Tim, that they'll be using, you suspect that they'll be using that period after the midterms and before the 2028 election to evaluate Ms. Harris and how she's doing in the commander-in-chief's role. And I think that's fairly astute and likely, but how do they get rid? How does the DNC, the people pulling the levers, the men and women behind the curtain, how do they get rid of an incumbent president? Because there's power in the incumbency, and it doesn't always play out to another term.
Well, it's true, but there's power in incumbency, particularly, of course, if you were actually elected to the position. If you simply stepped up to the position, for example, LBJ, when he stepped up after JFK was assassinated, he was the president, but he didn't feel validated until 1964 when he won a landslide victory. And it's sort of like a Sally Field moment for him. They like me. They like me. Right. And then he had the power of incumbency, which of course he wasn't able to harness because he dropped out because of Vietnam before 1968. But the point is that if they were secure with Kamala Harris as being the president in waiting, I don't think Joe Biden would have mentioned her name a dozen times in his announcement and surely in his subsequent campaign addresses. He'll be trying to boost her, which I think is a boost for Republicans, because this is someone who's been run up the flagpole, and Mark, nobody is saluting at Kamala Harris.
There's a fact. Now, do you think that the GOP will be targeting their campaigns, whoever the contender is? I mean, I presume we think the nomination is going to go to Donald Trump at the moment based on polling, but we'll get into that later in the show. But let's say Donald Trump or DeSantis or whoever it happens to may be, do you think they will be using Kamala Harris as their focal point? So will it be, this is me fighting against Joe Biden, or this is me fighting against Kamala Harris? Because to me, it seems that it's fairly obvious to everybody that there's no way that Joe Biden finishes this term for whatever reason, that he finishes a second term. So do you think that'd be an effective line of attack to essentially campaign against Kamala Harris now?
Well, look, she's got a lot of protection on the Democratic side, which is not to her advantage, frankly, because the fact that she's a woman of color makes her essentially untouchable. Now, if she was just a standard issue white guy, she could be dumped from the ticket and nobody would be the wiser. But he cannot afford to get rid of her for the same reason that he selected her in the first place. And the only reason he selected her, because she was not just a woman, but a woman of color. So she cannot be vanquished from the ticket for fear that she would chop off the progressive wing, who would be disgusted at the fact that a woman of color was taken off the ticket. It would be a sign of this, systemic racism that runs rampant through the U.S., according to the left. But this is a woman, look, shall I use the quotes? Shall I use her quotes?
Well, you know what, Tim, actually, I kind of want to come on to this because, Biden and Harris, they do share a certain commonality that is neither their gender nor their skin color. But that when they speak, the world around them kind of feels a little bit more stupid. And I know you and I have discussed the various quotes and whatnot from Kamala Harris. I'd just like to play a short clip here, Tim. Let me know what you think. Okay, here it comes.
So I think it's very important, as you have heard from so many incredible leaders, for us at every moment in time, and certainly this one, to see the moment in time in which we exist and are present, and to be able to contextualize it, to understand where we exist in the history and in the moment as it relates not only to the past but the future.
Well, Mark, that can't be embellished. I mean, that stands by itself. I will say this, that only Kamala could deliver such a statement. I mean, anybody else trying to imitate it couldn't. So
You're saying it's Churchillian in stature.
I'm saying she's inimitable. And
Right.
take that for whatever it's worth. But it's like her statement about school buses, where she said, and I'm going to quote her directly, "I'm excited about electric school buses. I love electric school buses. I just love them for so many reasons. Maybe because I went to school in a school bus. Hey, raise your hand if you went to school in a school bus," she exclaimed while raising her hand. First of all, shouldn't it have been our Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, who was handling the school bus caucus?
I think that
she speaks in another language, Scott. Mark, we need a separate lexicon, almost a dictionary, to translate Kamala Harris.
Kamala Ease. Kamala Ian.
Kamalese.
Kamalish.
We just made up a new term, Kamalese.
All right. Now,
I'm only sorry that I didn't get to actually restate Kamala's quote myself. I think it's very important. You've heard from some incredible leaders for at every moment, certainly this one, to see this moment in time that we exist, we're present, to be able to contextualize it. I'm so sorry you didn't give me the chance to read that. But you probably bailed me out because nobody could read it with the elan.
Or a straight face for that matter, Tim. Let's be honest.
True.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'd like to thank our special guest, longtime host of this here show, and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. And of course, extend my thanks to you at home for taking the time to join us. Now, my final thought for this week is prompted by a quote from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. The Queen tells Alice, "Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast," she says. And it seems that we're in this position of having to believe that impossible things are an almost certainty. More than half the country believes stridently that Joe Biden cannot win another election. And more than half the country, possibly even the same half, believes the same thing of Donald Trump. But yet here we are in our own little wonderland, faced with the absolute probability that at least one of these impossible things is going to happen. Perhaps like the Queen of Hearts, we should begin practicing such mixed belief for at least half an hour per day. My thanks to you. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.